Good morning, everyone. It is Friday, July 9th. This is a meeting of the Topeka City Council's Social Service Grants Committee. We have the grants have been reviewed and scored, and so this is our meeting where the focus is to simply look at that scoring and see if we did make some changes this year, so to see if it turned out the way we expected it to. In terms of the scoring, excuse me, and that is the sole reason for this meeting. We don't, as far as our minutes go, it's been, 3 or 4 months since we met, and those minutes were approved in our 30-day window that the council rules provide, so we really have just the one agenda item to do the reviews as much as is needed. So with that, let me have my colleagues introduce themselves. Councilwoman?
Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala from District 2.
And Tony Emerson, representing District 4.
And I'm Karen Hiller, representing District 1, and the chair. So unless there are any technical things we need to address, we will just jump right into our review. Okay. Those of us on the committee and the lead staff have copies of the spreadsheet. My understanding is those of us on the committee did not get this until last night, so have not had a chance to ask any questions even of staff. With that, I think there are some questions. My understanding is that this has not gone out to the agencies. People are just here to kind of see how it's going. With that, especially because there are some questions, we are not going to mention names of any of the agencies. We're going to try not to, but just talk instead about process and scoring because we have some questions. Okay? Deal? All right. With that, then, let me lead over to Brett Martin from United Way, if that's the appropriate person. And could you talk to us a little bit about methodology? In particular, just to set the stage, this committee did make a couple of changes in the targeting of the dollars and the scoring. And this is the first time we've gone through a process after those changes. The idea was to shift from inviting new programs at all to saying that a program needed to have been around for 3 years before they were eligible to apply. And what we did then, and anybody correct me if I'm misstating that, was to expect that, this is my understanding of what the committee was expecting, that we would then everybody be on an even playing field. There wouldn't be any new guys that didn't have history. There had been a split way of scoring based on new programs that did not have program and grant administration history, and the ones that were long-term. And what the committee understood, as I understood it, was that we would simply check references either with the city if they'd been city funded or other funders if it had been elsewhere, so that we had, so that everybody was being, again, reviewed and scored the same. That did not happen, so we want to have United Way explain it through. I think I've kind of tried to figure out why some of the things might have been done a little differently, and there might be good reasons for that we just need to understand. And with that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Councilwoman. Thanks for the opportunity to administer the RFP and the scoring and the technical assistance for the applicants for the social services grants through the City of Topeka. To just begin in terms of the initial question, as a team, when we got together before the scoring of the applications with our scorers, we were still under the impression that we would be scoring new programs and eliminating the questions based on past grant effectiveness and based on outcomes, and so that we would have essentially 3 sets of points possible. One would be 100 points, one would be 90 points, and one would be 70 points, based on whether or not the city was able to speak to the past grant effectiveness, and whether or not the program was able to demonstrate through their application that they had achieved their outcomes in previous iterations of the program. And so we left with that understanding, and so that's why you see in the far right column, you see the total points possible and then the scores out of those. And then those are reflected in the percentage of the fourth column from the left score. So the 2 decimal point score there is the percentage out of the points possible. And out of those we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13 of those were out of 100, and then others, depending upon the information given in the past grant effectiveness, were either out of 90, or if they did not have those outcomes, out of 70. So that's how those are reflected in the right column, but also in the fourth column from the left under score. It sounds like that this committee had different expectations for those. We did not have in the rubric any guidance related to checking of references for the history of past grant effectiveness, which is the second to last question in the rubric. So we relied, as we have in the past, on the City of Topeka staff to score that section. Past grant administration is effective, the 10-5-0 points.
Yeah, and I looked in the minutes. I didn't have much time, so I didn't, if I missed a word, and I certainly didn't review the tapes. My recollection was that we did discuss that, and that it would require checking with whoever their funders had been, not just the city, if it had been somebody else. And as I recall, we raised that issue because we wanted to make sure that you were comfortable with that, but you don't recall that?
We did not have that in any of our meeting notes that we left with. And so we're happy to make changes as necessary. I don't know what the process would be for us checking references, because there's nothing in the application that asks for information. So we would need to contact each of those programs and gather contact information from prior funders, and then be able to probably work with city staff to figure out how we would score them, either 10, 5, or 0, based on past grant administration is effective. So.
Right.
Of the applicants, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 of those would have been scored out of 90 points. And then
Like 8 or 70.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those scored out of 70. And again, the 90 came based on when we shared the application with the city, then Rochelle was able to go in and was able to put a score in there, or be able to indicate that they had not been fully funded for a year, so that there was no way to measure the grant effectiveness. So for example, theoretically, you could have a program that was funded last year that you wouldn't be able to score on past grant effectiveness because of the delay in the grant year. So you would only be able to look at first quarter to determine whether or not they had, whether or not the reporting and invoicing was on time and paperwork is accurate for that program. And I don't know that 1 quarter is enough to be able to measure that past grant effectiveness.
I wondered about that because some of the agencies that only had 90 have been funded by the city before.
Just 2021, which we don't have, we've only.
Well,
one
some of
quarter
them before that too.
Oh.
They're pretty recognizable.
So again,
Are mics on? I'm sorry, are mics on, Karen? Because I did not hear what staff's response
I don't
was.
think she could hear you.
Go ahead.
Oh, all I said was that if they were only funded last year, then we only had 1 quarter to base that score on, so.
So there was no look back farther than
than-
this immediate year in terms
Right.
of even the rating from the city.
Exactly.
Is that correct, Rochelle, when you went in
When you went in and put your scoring in?
for past grant effectiveness?
If they had, so I went back to 2020 because that would be the full year. If they had a
Can you
grant-
pull your mic a little closer, especially with your mask? Thank you.
Okay, so I went back to 2020, that would be the full year. If they had the program, then yes, I could tell. If they submitted reports to the city, then yes, I looked at to see if there was past grant administration. There was a lot of new programs that were not funded in 2020, so that's when I said, I don't have a score for them because they were new, they were not funded in 2020. There was a couple that were maybe funded in 2021, but again, that would be first quarter, and then that would go through the United Way. So I went back to the 2020 year.
So then all of those that she indicated in there that had no grant history to be able to be scored were either 90 or 70. And 90, again, depending upon whether or not they were able to show those outcomes, 70 if they didn't show any of those outcomes.
Help me with that again. They either had history or they didn't, right?
But there are 2 scores that indicate history. One would be
Right.
an outcomes question that's worth 20 points, and one is a 10-point question on grant effectiveness. So if in fact they didn't have the outcomes to demonstrate, then we zeroed that out and made it out of 70, 20 points for the outcomes, 10 points for the history of grant effectiveness, and then took their raw score and divided it by 70.
Kick in if you want, colleagues. In the past, it was either 70 or 100 because you'd either been funded by the city before and had history, or you hadn't been funded and didn't have history. So I'm still having a little trouble where they'd have one of them to rate but not the other.
Let me see if I can pull one without sharing a name.
And maybe Rochelle can help too, but I don't know how much communication you all had back and forth or how this was settled.
I'm not exactly sure where the 90 came from. I know,
So we have a program here. That in their application, they completed a section, their table, their matrix for outcomes, and they indicated in that they had, through the numbers that they entered into the matrix, that they had achieved all of their outcomes in the 2020 year. However, in the past grant effectiveness area, they indicated that in the 2020 grant year, the comment that we had in the score from the city indicated that they were not funded in that year. So it could have been that they put in numbers from 2020, for example, that weren't city numbers, if that makes sense, through city dollars. But they were able to demonstrate outcomes from the year 2020 in the matrix, but they weren't in fact City of Topeka grantees in 2020. Therefore, they were out of 90 because they were able to demonstrate outcomes, but the dollars that they received for the program didn't come from the City of Topeka, if that makes sense. So that's where a 90 score would be, for example.
So would that mean that the ones that were allowed only 70 had not been using outcomes and did not report any?
That's correct.
And so we gave them a bye?
We scored them out of 70 instead of out of 100 or out of 90, for example, based on the conversations that we had as a team, based on what we left the meeting with. So we could have left with incorrect information on our end in scoring them out of 70. Based on the current thresholds within the current spreadsheet that you have in front of you, that would affect 1, 2, 3, 4 programs. There were 4 programs scored out of 70 that were above the scoring threshold. And again, those percentages are reflected in the 4th column from the left, underscore.
Because that what that means is that the ones that had the 90 just because of the grant reporting, self-reported that they had outcomes and outputs and reported how that had resulted.
Correct.
Which of course is a top priority with us.
Correct.
So the 70s, just to clarify, reported that they hadn't been operating on an outcomes and outputs basis to all appearances.
Correct. In the year 2020, which is what they would have been directed to do in the application.
Okay. Councilman.
Chair, I guess, I think you guys made this change last year, right, to the way you wanted them scored? Or it was a meeting, I wasn't on the committee yet when you made that change, I don't think, to the methodology that you're referring to, doing out of
Correct, because that was in the fall of 2020 to set up for the year 2021.
Yeah, I guess my question maybe goes more to the reasoning of that. Is it because it maybe unfairly benefits new programs because they don't have as many things to be rated on?
And Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala can help me on this too. The idea was, some of the conversation anyway, was that when you have a new program, it's fairly easy to get money, to get it started and test it. What's important, what can be harder is to get that long-term money to sustain it over time. And so we'd moved away, this committee had moved, the city went through a short period of saying, let's fund new stuff. And there were really tiny grants all over the place, and the committee some years ago said, you know what, that's not the best investment of these dollars. We think that providing longer term dollars in an amount at least $10,000 is on the agency's end and on ours for admin as well as the contribution to the program more valuable. And so that overall was the thread that has been coming forward. And then, but we had for I don't know, 5 years or so, maybe there's nobody here who would know except the agencies, that there was an opportunity to take on new programs, not to leave them out entirely.
Sure.
But it was a lower cap, was less money, and only if there were dollars available. But they were only scored on the 70 points because they didn't have, at that point, the city staff was handling it all. Corey was here, so she can help me with this. And so, right or wrong, it was based on whether they had history with the city. And so if they didn't have history with the city, they got a chance to get scored without it. But anybody who then was in successive years was expected to have performed on what they said they were going to do and done responsible grants management. And since the city had been managing those grants, it was easy for, those were the two sections that were scored by the staff.
Okay.
Particularly the grant management, but you all, were just our staff was who was accepting the reports and negotiating the numbers and then the contracts and so on. So it was all kind of self-contained, city to city to city. And so when this group wanted to change that last year, the idea was let's really look at sustaining programs that have already demonstrated success. We want to know from the get-go that that they're using outputs and outcomes and that they've been able to demonstrate success with that and that they've been able to demonstrate successful grant management for us to move them into our funding pool was the idea. But obviously missed some signals in getting some clarity in the admin part of it and maybe in the application form or the process to have it be abundantly clear all the way through.
And Sheriff, if I may, so hearing that, I think, if I understood you correctly, we would wish the majority of the funding went to sustain programs that have been shown to be effective and have been around for a while. And even though the methodology wasn't what the committee thought, the results ended up being, right? 92% of the ones that have been around got funded. Of the 90s, 2/3, 67% got funded, and then only 50% of the new ones got funded. So even though they didn't use the methodology, it looks like the outcomes were,
It worked out okay.
yeah. I mean, in my mind, because 92% of the ones that have been around out of 100 got funded, and only 50% of the ones that were 70s got funded. So, it looks like it worked even if that wasn't the original
It did.
intent.
I mean, you
Now,
got
I
it.
realize there could be a change in scores slightly if some of those other categories were added, but it wouldn't be a significant amount of money difference, I wouldn't think, in any one grantee. Just
There was a significant difference to the last one in line simply because that agency got only whatever percentage their score merited based on the money that was left. As you go down the line, that's how it goes.
I
And
see.
so,
Sure.
But that's a really good observation. I kind of struggled with looking at it and not understanding for sure how it happened.
Counsel, if I may?
Please.
Okay. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Brett was saying. I don't recall us making an official change. I do recall us having a discussion about checking references
Okay,
and
thank you.
changing. I do recall that, but I don't recall making the change. I asked Rochelle, she's not recalling it, and neither United Way. So
Oh, we didn't bring it home,
I don't
obviously.
think. I don't think so. I mean, I could certainly go check, but I don't recall that, and I feel like I would have remembered that.
Well, and I looked for it in the minutes,
Yeah,
but I was hurrying, so I thought, well, maybe somebody else found it.
yeah. So I just wanted to throw that out there so you know.
No, I appreciate that, because we made changes, and we know that, and often there's loose ends when that happens, and so you don't want it to happen, but it happens. So,
Chair?
please.
So what would that mean then if it wasn't, if we didn't go all the way with that? Would that mean that this would be something that we would need to work towards for the next cycle?
Yes, And that's typically what we've done if there was something in the way that it was set up. But we need, we have this session to make sure it went the way we'd intended. But typically, if somehow we missed a signal and we saw how it played out in terms of the priorities or, the process, the scoring, whatever, we would hold those changes to the next year and stay true to the cycle. But here, if people remembered it differently, we needed to wash that out and make sure that we all understood what we were doing. But yes.
So with the verbal articulation that this was not recalled, to put this formally into the new process, will we have to go back and actually look at the minutes and the meetings, or we're just moving from here that we didn't finish it off? Okay.
Well, that's what a meeting's for, right? And if
Right.
if
Right.
some of us anyway remember the discussion, but it's not in the minutes and we didn't seem to close it. Maybe lessons learned of when that comes up, checking with the committee and saying, we've got to disconnect with what it looks like your intent was. Let's double check the intent before we move forward. And of course, with you guys being vendors, there's a three-way communication there. And I wanted to I think we've learned, but from the conversation to see whether there'd been conversation amongst you all and we didn't know, or just, lessons learned on that too.
Well, and Chair, I think that obviously, this isn't about micromanaging. This is about communication, though. And I definitely agree with you on that part. We had so many meetings about this, and, we were articulating things that didn't get finalized. This particular point didn't get finalized. So to me, due diligence on all parts would be, for us all to stay in that communication chain, in that communication link. I know that there had been another previous, meeting that I had to have with folks about some issues with communication. And I think on all sides, that's what we need to be striving for in the capacity that we have and the responsibilities that we have in our separate realms. So thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Likely looking at the scores that weren't funded, I don't know how we would score the others on a revisit. Actually, the ones that were funded, it would affect the one that was last in line by just our methodology that was adopted. Got what was left. The issue for us is we need to decide today whether to endorse this and let the agencies know and move forward. We have always offered an appeal process, but we tried to be real conscientious about what we were doing so that we were solid on how the awards were made. So, Councilman.
Thank you, Chair. I guess one question, because I didn't catch that until you mentioned it, that the last gets truncated, whatever's left over, they get the remainder. But in this case, it's the last two. Is there a reason for that?
It was a tie. There was a tie in their score.
Okay,
Gotcha.
thank you.
Then underneath, you'll see the process for determining the tie award recommendation. So I took the total joint request of those two programs
Okay.
and then broke it out by percentage and then applied that percentage to the difference
Okay.
and then applied that percentage of the difference to their reductions.
And importantly, at least to me, those are both out of 100, so
Correct.
those wouldn't have been changed by any, okay,
By any.
thank you.
No, but their scores are substantially higher than some of the others.
Right, yeah, as far as points.
Yep.
Sure.
Right.
Thank you for that, by the way.
with that change, it's not real clear whether the low-scoring ones had not ever, well, I just don't know how their scores would have come out. They've been around, they're not new programs. So it might have come out about the same. There are a couple of these, Brett, that don't have program names on them. They just have the agency name on them. And I don't want to name any names, but is there actually a program?
That's what they entered into the program section in terms of the title in EC Impact. So,
Two that I'm looking at are multi-program agencies, and so I'm wondering in terms of just their qualifying for the categories that are our priorities, and also to measure, they must have brought it down in terms of what they said they were applying for.
So you're speaking of the program area? Because we have the program name there.
Correct, and so
So-
there's an agency name and a program name, and there are a
Right.
couple of them that simply duplicate that on this report, or
Correct.
darn close to it. And in the two that I'm looking at, those organizations have multiple programs, some of which would be eligible for our funding, and some might not. In order to do the outputs and outcomes, they've got to be pretty specific about what we're funding. So, and again, they must have done okay on describing what they were planning, or they wouldn't have gotten the points they did.
Right.
But they should have been able to tell us some history if they're really 3 years old with whatever they wanted us to do. Does that make sense? I mean, you guys know
I'm just seeing two of them. So
they're,
where the agency name is duplicated in the program name. And maybe and I went ahead and numbered the rows 1 through 30.
the report that we have, it doesn't have the numbers.
No,
Right.
I just went ahead and just counted them, sorry, just now, so I had, there are 30 of them. We did have 30 applicants this year.
Line 14, line 17.
Mm-hmm.
Are the two.
Okay. And one of those was scored, both of those were scored out of 70. All three, actually, I guess, if you look at number 23.
Number 23. Oh,
So,
well, for 22.
yeah, I guess depending on how you're numbering, if you number from agency name as 1, or if you number from the top one.
Because they would have been screened coming in based on our 6 priority categories, right? In terms of whether they were even eligible.
Right.
Yes, and they all indicated in their program description of need, and the activities that they aligned with the RFP.
And they would also choose the area, which on this particular report that I brought as well, it's all the comments, it lists the area that they applied under.
I don't like thinking on the fly, but we're here. I guess if others did, that didn't have history with city, but I identified their outcomes and outputs, and then also reported on having done that in the past and the results, just to treat everybody the same, it would seem that we should do that with everyone, if they're going to get the points. But not to give them a bye on the points if they didn't answer that question.
Chair,
Please.
because this only being my second year on this committee, and because we had so many meetings last year, and obviously you and I thought that there were going to be changes, that particular change. And now we look at these two particular agencies that have been longstanding and have been greatly reduced. In addition to just getting this late yesterday afternoon, I'm just going to say right now, I do not feel like I can vote on anything. Because I need to come in there, and I don't know if you and I need to, and whoever else have a meeting to get me more comfortable with where we're at on this. And you mentioned on the fly. I feel right now like this is on the fly for me to do any kind of approval. Just my input.
If we're not ready to vote, we need to be able to give our vendor or the staff some direction in what we need, and decide what we're going to do. I think, something that's been a hallmark of the work of this committee is to be fair, is to just do, and we've worked as hard as we can to get the guidelines clear and the scoring fair, and we've offered appeals because we think that that's fair too, but we really don't want them. We want it to be pretty self-evident that we were consistent and that we were fair, and to be able to stand by those recommendations when they come through. So I mean, if what we've got is some questions about whether everybody was scored fairly and in the same way on their reporting on accomplishment of outcomes and outputs, that might deserve some review, it sounds like. The issue would be if it wasn't clear on checking references, for instance, for grant management, or even outputs and outcomes in terms of what, other than just self-reporting, what somebody had actually said on a grant. Although that would come out a little bit on the grant reporting. If it wasn't clear and we want to let that go this year, that's important to see if we could settle now. If we want our vendor to go back and check some references on the ones who didn't have them, just to get this moving along, we should tell them so. So let's leave that on the table for the moment. Are there any other things that came to your attention or questions from the committee about the process? About what we have in hand in terms of the scoring and the awards, I should say. I know there's some process questions that we'll address when we review the whole process, but.
Chair,
Yes.
I would just say too that I understand that it may be an inconvenience or not within the norm to actually physically call, these some of these organizations. How many did we say that they were that would need to be contacted?
8.
Did Brett say
8.
that?
There are
8.
8.
Yeah,
Well, there actually are 17 that that got either the 90 or the 70.
Correct.
And those agencies, if they weren't funded by us, have been funded by somebody else before in terms of grant management.
Right.
You know, I didn't know because I just didn't know. Looking at it, was like, well, did they never ever use outcomes and outputs before? And we gave them a buy because it was just new. And the question, if that was the case, was should we or not? Because that's important to us. But if that's not how the decision got made.
my thought on this is that I don't think that we should leave that possibility of contacting the agencies that we need to contact to get that information. Because if we don't, and we are still working through the process, right? The agencies shouldn't have to feel the ramifications from that. So that would be my thought.
I mean, just in terms of time, there are some that did not score high enough that even with checking
Right.
the references might not get it this time.
Right.
So there could be a kind of split in the difference if we wanted to ask to have that done. But again, we didn't close the deal on that clarification in terms of our vendor's time, and so on.
And we would need some clarification on how to score that. So for example, would we call an applicant, funder, and say, how would you score them? Because then we would be allowing someone outside of the process to tell us whether or not they would give them a score of, for example, on past grant.
Well, we
Effectiveness.
worked on that quite a bit with the staff over time. It's fairly clear. I think 10 points if reporting and invoicing is on time and paperwork is accurate. 5 if reporting is on time but paperwork is not accurate. And 0 if just hasn't been very effective. It's not too bad.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking if I call a funder who's not familiar with the process at all and say, how would you score them, the 10, 5, and 0, I just would want to make sure that they are applying on time and accurate in the same way that Rochelle would be applying on time and accurate. I understand that those words are fairly clear. It's either on time or it's late. It's either accurate or there was an inaccuracy in an invoice or in a report or something like that. I would just want to make sure that we have clear guidance if we're going to call a funder, because we'll be putting that score in that funder's hands.
Correct. And we have had some back and forth about that. Like if somebody knew it was going to be late, they had a question, didn't get a call back, now it's late.
Yeah.
Things like that. You get inside that
Right.
places you don't want to go.
Right,
But
right.
yeah.
Hello, I'm Juliet McDiffett with United Way. So I have a question. If we're calling these funders, how do we know, can they give us that information? And I also had another question. How do we know they're telling, I mean, are we just going to tell them, they're going to obviously say yes. I mean, how are they going to show proof to us? They're not going to, they're not going to say, no, I've been late. That's just a question I have. It's how is that going to benefit calling an agency?
I think we were talking about calling the funder. So we would have to find out who their funders were and then call one of their funders if it was
So we need to contact,
United Way of Greater Topeka.
And
For
would
like
they,
checking
So we
references
are-
on a job.
and would they
Topeka
give
Community
that to
Foundation.
us? I mean, us contacting them and letting them know
Yeah,
who
I
we
don't know
are.
because it wasn't part of the application
Right.
process where we would potentially be,
So there's no release necessarily.
there is no release of
Right.
information. Again, and I guess that's where I'm not recalling this at all, because this would have required a wholesale change to the application.
Yes.
Where there would have been a qualifications process, where they would have had to, if you are a new applicant, you would have a drop down and you would have to list funders and contact information in order for us to be able to follow that, which, again, if I'd left a meeting with that, that's that's several hours worth of work that we would have had to rework the entire application for. So would have been a significant change for us, which it's not an inconvenience. It's just a change in the process where we would need to make sure that we built it in that way. So that we have release of information, so that we have contact information. Now it would, for example, if we did this, we would call 17 applicants and ask for a release of information, and then ask for previous funder contact information. And
We
then
actually did work on the budget to make sure that we were getting full agency budget, and there's a drop down that asked for 2 years back on funding sources. So that's already in there.
Do they list those
They're supposed to.
specifically, though?
They don't list who, they just list that they received funding, but I don't think it
It
says
says
from
click
who.
to itemize, and so if we're not gathering that information, they're not giving us everything we asked for.
Having it in front of me.
Well,
Trying
it
to
was
remember.
something that, even before you came on board, that for a while, the city staff wasn't asking for that background, and we didn't have that full picture of the program or the agency, and so been working on making sure that got collected, and that's part of,
We do collect that, we just don't ask for their contact information, so then we
Sure.
put the name, so that
at
would
least
be
we've got,
correct, yeah.
I thought it was in there.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at.
And that was to gather that context if, for whatever purposes, so.
What page is that, Karen, that you're looking at?
I've got my notes from our October meeting where we have,
Oh.
they gave us a sample of a filled out application form.
Yeah,
And also.
I have that. I have that application.
Yeah. Uh-oh,
I got the old battery. I don't have my new battery yet.
uh-oh.
Outlet behind you there.
Tech break.
I guess, Chair, would the, would maybe your suggestion be that, or my one way out of this would be they attempt to do this and come back with, maybe they find that this is a easy thing and that people are cooperative, the funders, and if they find that's not the case,
Well, there's doing that or going ahead and letting that one go this year, but reviewing, perhaps rescoring if people failed to turn in any results from prior years on outcomes and outputs.
And I guess I think Brett mentioned they would call 17, but as you said earlier, some of these are, even if they got perfect, it's not going to change. They're not going to get funded. These people, the ones at the bottom of the list. So
Correct.
I don't know if it might be a waste of time to, to call on those ones where it wouldn't impact anyway.
It would impact maybe not a lot, but the distribution all the way up and down the line if there was a difference between 90 and 100.
Sure, no, absolutely. I just meant you wouldn't necessarily need to call the bottom four. A perfect score on these two other categories wouldn't get them above 60%.
But overall, that threshold for our seasoned agencies is 81. So,
Yeah, I was simply pointing out that you didn't need to necessarily call all 17.
right.
Maybe it's 14 or 13 or 10. where difference in score would matter with the distribution and the placement.
Well, the big one that will affect the scores is the 20 points for outcomes and outputs from prior years.
Sure. And that affects, I think, 4 that are
And
in
that
the money.
doesn't
if you
necessarily,
will.
if in fact, what we did on those that self-reported was to count it and put them at a 90-point level, then one could argue that the ones who did not self-report didn't get 20 points.
Sure.
That way, everybody would have been expected to report. We wouldn't be treating them differently, but maybe there's a difference in, we need to review again on how those choices were made.
Councilmember, if I may.
Please.
We didn't have the 90 last year, as we obviously
Right.
are talking about. I think that it would be fair to not allow a self-report and change those folks back to the out of 70 instead of 90. If they didn't have their unless they just simply have never done outcomes, which, but if we had them all, those agencies without past grant effectiveness and outcomes at 70, that would seem more fair than having some self-report and the others not able to do that. Even though it was given as an option, they maybe didn't realize that was the case. Just a thought.
Well, as I thought through it, different funding sources ask for reporting in different ways. And so, but what we want is agencies that are seasoned in operating. I don't know.
But couldn't some of those still have a first quarter from 2020? And that's the numbers that they would have put in some of those, because all of those 90s.
Or
means-
outcomes.
Yeah,
Okay.
all of the 90s did report outcomes.
But it was for the first quarter of 21? Is that what you're
No,
saying?
it was-
Okay.
Or,
For the prior year.
Well, then they would have prior grant administration.
right,
Well, just not with the city.
but not a full
If it
year
was
with the
somebody
city.
else.
So in Rochelle's notes, she did have an indication that they didn't have a full year of prior grant cycle experience, so we couldn't score them because there's only 1 quarter's worth of information to go on at that point.
Yeah, but that kind of brings us back to those they self-reported, which seems like something we should look at.
Right, and we could, again, we're not naming names, but we could go into these each individually and look to see if they matched up with what was in EC impact from the report.
Sure. The problem with the first quarter is, for instance, I saw one that historically has had live in-person programming. And if 2020 affected that, or if
Precisely.
sometimes, and we also know, and too, sometimes there are seasonal pushes and lulls, and so it's understandable that you
Correct.
didn't want to just use 1 quarter worth of anything for particularly program reporting.
And our panelists mentioned that when they were scoring, that they were wondering about those outcomes because they would have set that logic model up pre-COVID, and then they were operating in COVID.
Right.
So,
But, and help me, I'm flipping through here again, but is the outcomes reporting for the current year or the full year prior? It was for our full
It's
year.
2020 is what is in the,
Right.
Yeah,
So-
in the
is that
application.
right?
So
Yeah,
2020 was
2020
a
and
weird
then-
year
Right,
for many services.
correct. And there was discussion among the panelists when we got to this one related to outcomes about what they, about how they should score it because they recognized that it was affected by COVID. So actually, one of the things that the group did throughout across the board was these are 90, 75, 50, and 25%. But those only work if you have certain numbers of outcomes. So for example, if you have three outcomes, then all of those are going to be reduced by 33%. None of those match 90, 75, 50, 25. So what the panelists decided as a process piece is that if they got 2/3, so 2 of their 3 outcomes, they received 15 points, which says 75% of outcomes, except that you can't get to 75% with 3 outcomes. So they moved them up to the next level on each of those because they didn't know how to score it otherwise. And that's part of a larger conversation that they had, which is a process review piece at some point when we go through the process review, that they questioned whether or not they should be scoring those at all, or if that should be scored by City of Topeka staff in the same way that past grant administration is. They just had questions about how to do that. So it's something for us to consider. But they did take COVID into effect there. And again, if an individual program met 2 of the 3 outcomes, they scored them at 15 points out of 20, feeling that it was unfair to score them at 10 because that's half, and they had more than half, but they didn't have 90, but they didn't have half, so they went to 15 points.
Well, my thought is that those were intended to be guidelines, but not strict, so that
Right.
sounds good
Right.
to me.
And they applied that consistently through 30 applications.
That's what,
So-
that consistency for everybody in this room and for including us is what's most important, so thank you for that.
Yeah, we spent, just as I timed each of our applications that they scored, and it was almost an hour on the first one because it was just building out process. So how are we going to do this all the way through? And even when we got to 26, for example, someone would say, how did we do that in application 1 or application 2? And so there was very strong consistency all the way through in terms of how those were applied in all of the rubric areas.
Okay. Were there any other sections that not that we're looking for, digging for anything, but that there were issues that, and I ask that because we want to have a really great process, but also if somebody goes and later and feels like they weren't treated fairly, if we're on the table now about anything that was wobbly, then maybe we can get ahead of it.
Yeah, there were a few process pieces that they had recommendations for. There's no budget question, for example, in any of it. And so they use the organization has the resources to produce outcomes efficiently and effectively as the budget question. That's how and so then again, they applied that consistently all the way through. They had a question about weighting outcomes at 20 points out of 100 when some organizations only have 1 outcome. So that means then that you're weighting an application, 20% of an application on them meeting 1 outcome. Some have 3 outcomes, some have 4 outcomes, some have 1 outcome. There's not a minimum level of outcomes. And so there was a question about whether or not it's inappropriately weighted to do 20 points on an outcome when then it's just one outcome for some, but then it's 3 or 4 outcomes for others. And so it would certainly be something for us to take a look at
I
potentially.
think for the city and for this group, historically, the issue is we want to make sure that there's a result coming out, that there's
Right.
why are we even doing this, is being satisfied and it's making a meaningful change, not just
Right.
going through motions.
Right,
And
exactly.
so that's, that being the difference between outcomes, or outputs and outcomes. So
Right.
what, how many people walked in the door?
Right.
How'd it go?
Are they any better off? Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and then the other piece with that is that if a program, for example, in a COVID year doesn't meet that one outcome, their score there is 0 because you can't do a % of nothing. So they couldn't get, there couldn't be a 75% of outcomes when there's only one outcome, for example. And so they just had questions about that. Is that you're putting 20 points potentially for some programs on one outcome because they don't list any other outcomes because there's not a minimum number of outcomes. So they could just list one, for example.
Well, and there's been some discussion in the past about just how many years. You can have an odd year, maybe you're building a new building or something,
Right.
Whatever, or you lose another source of funding, so you can't have your whole.
Right.
It looks like the scoring, we didn't get a spreadsheet. Sometimes we get a spreadsheet that shows how they scored on each one.
Mm-hmm.
I think usually we do, actually, and it's a little easier for us to scan down and see
Yeah.
how.
I have one of those here. It's in
This one.
2.3 font, but it is here.
But Corey's got a way that she was able to get it on at least legal with little angled headings, so a little cross communication there. Okay, I see 3 things still. One is the program itself identified and eligible, the outputs and outcomes, success, possibly the COVID relations, but then the grant management.
Oh, hey. All right. Mr. Williams.
Yeah, good. Okay. Okay. I think so that we can make decisions, if we want to review or want staff to review anything that, from what we have in front of us, we need to at least decide that today.
I guess,
Can't.
Chair, if I could.
Councilman.
Thank you. Brett, do you guys do this type of thing for other organizations?
We do them on all of our grants. And so we have 72. We have 72 different programs and agencies that we do this for within United Way,
Yeah.
at least.
And I guess my question then is the process we use what you use as well?
No, it's different. So significantly different in some ways. And so we've brought this last year, we brought some of those technical assistance pieces to this process, but it is a much different process for us. So this is ultimately based on a score that comes out at the end. Mm-hmm. The scores for us are a process, but aren't the end. So we have an additional discussion process, but also all of our grants are broken out into other areas so that they're smaller chunks. So for example, in our basic needs work, we have applicants in food assistance. We have in safety from domestic violence, rent utilities assistance, healthcare and prescription assistance. So they're not broken out into, say, 2 large categories, emergency aid and prevention. So they're in smaller groups. Then there's a score, and we run average, median, average without high and low, but then that goes into a larger discussion question, or a larger discussion, a facilitated discussion, and that's where the amounts are decided upon, but not based on a percent score.
Okay.
That's then applied to a score or an amount requested.
And how much money, here we're, 435,000. How much are you guys distributing through your process?
In the past up to $1 million in different areas in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 areas. So,
I guess, and I know this is kind of maybe outside the bounds of our meeting, but I just wonder sometimes, are we going about this whole thing wrong? Should we simply be, frankly, outsourcing the whole thing? I mean, even, give them the money and let them distribute it through their process they already have, but,
Well, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
That's for the fall discussions. In the early years of the social service of this grant, there was a process much more like what Brent, sorry, we got Brent and Brett here. Sorry, keep crisscrossing, sorry. What Brett has described, where we had a panel of 3 who were representative of active funding agencies, and they did the hearings. They had a scoring system, but they also were familiar, and we've worked to put that into this one. But with what was happening community-wide, with the different agencies and funding abilities and coalitions to move toward X or Y goal and so on. So they did apply that subjective, if you want to call it that, wrap around to make those final recommendations to the city at the time. And I report that because I was one of those grantees, rather, that went through that process every year, whether I liked it or not, as opposed to, it's been a while now. And when the council decided about 10 years ago that they wanted to overhaul it, because they at that point it had been contracted out for some time, and the staff just wasn't comfortable, or council wasn't comfortable with how it was going. There were a lot of appeals and so on. Wanted to reel it in, and at that point, that committee felt like a score would be more generic and allow subjectivity that might be questioned to be not included in it.
Right.
And there are good reasons for that too.
right.
So,
I think though, hearing what Brett said earlier, though, there are a lot of judgment calls they have to make during
anyway,
the process. Yeah. So, in the business I'm in, doing large projects, an old estimator one time told me, he said, estimating is you start at a point at random and then proceed with extreme precision. And that's kind of what this is. I mean, you're doing a lot of subjective things, and then in the end it comes down to a couple numbers, and
Right.
it's really, my gosh, this 98 could be a 68 or a 78 or depending on how those subjective things go throughout the whole process. So I guess at the end of the day, I feel like there's not ever going to be a perfect process, and I like what Brett said, that they go around afterwards and there's some discussion, that it's not just all a number, because there's some things that frankly are more important. And the last time I was on this committee, one of the things that really troubled me was we didn't give money to an early childhood thing that was hosted at Highland Park High School. And to me, that was such an important thing, let kids who had children when they were still in school, to let them finish and to get those babies cared for. And to me, that was frankly, was so much more important than some of these other things.
that's exactly why they came up with the scoring system.
I know. I just, at the end of the day, I just think some things are so darn important, and I just.
Yeah, there are other
Yeah.
funding sources in town. We are
Yes.
not at all
Yeah.
the big dog in that, and so we, part of the fundamental is that the city can't do everything, has chosen to have its hand in when many cities do not,
Yeah.
and needs to find a way that's consistent and fair. That part of why it went to the scoring was because often council members have favorite charities, or their
Sure.
heart's big for one of those priorities, and that just was so cumbersome and didn't necessarily improve.
And I guess, and that's my whole reason, maybe it's better if we hand this whole process to an outside.
Yeah, well, let's reel it back
So,
in.
yeah,
In
yes,
the way that
sorry.
we decided to handle that is to work really hard on a plan for the upcoming process and stick with it, and then, and be as fair and thorough as we can, and then review it for the next year. But once sort of a deal's a deal, we just got to make sure that what we did intend to happen happened the best that we can. So,
I'm sorry, am I allowed to ask a question?
sure.
My question is, you wanted people that had 3 years of tenure.
Can
does
we
that-
get him to a mic?
Oh,
Here. So if you could go up to the, okay.
Great, thank you. You know, the TV watching audience has to.
right. Well, I'm sorry. My question is about the 3-year tenure. That is the qualification. Does that mean that the program that they're actually applying money to has been around for 3 years, or the establishment has been around for 3 years? Because, I mean, it was a capacity grant, from my understanding, that would allow them to improve or make a better impact, which means that they may create some new programs to do that with?
I have it.
Pardon me?
I have it with me if you would like me to read the statement. It's the agency program must be in operation for 2 years prior to the date of the application. That's what the committee decided on.
So it is the program
It's the
itself?
program and has been established and running so that it's through its startup period, has a track record.
Thank you.
Sure. And we're doing mostly committee stuff, and a lot of these folks have been around to process this, but when we do the review, you'll have your scores, you'll know how it went, you'll have a chance to check with them any questions, and then everybody's on deck to talk about how to do it differently if we want to change it for the next year. So. Okay. Kind of a combination between what the committee's feeling and what you, our vendors, feel like. You're much more inside what these applications are and whether there would be some tweaking if you spend a little more time on them or not.
So if we made the decision today to go back, I would want to be clear about if we were doing only 100 points possible, or if we were doing 90 points possible and moving the 70s to 90s based on outcomes. And then secondary to that would be, what specific questions are we asking of prior funders in order to gather the information and the scores.
With that question from you, were you anticipating that in order to go from 70 to 90, you all would not just be accepting a self-report, but would be going back to the prior funders to ask for that
Yeah, we would.
program
Yeah,
report?
yeah. So we would need to have verification. I guess we need to have verifications on the 90s and verifications on the 70s
Well, I would think,
for all outcomes. And then if that were the case, then we might as well ask that funder
correct,
about past grant administration,
correct, that's what I
which
was
would then
thinking.
take it all to 100.
Yeah. Because if
If-
you're
if-
not
if
going
we
on
were
a
to do that.
self-report, if part of our disconnect is a self-report on the 20 points, if it needs to be verified, then. So there would probably require a double check. They have reported, they should have, their prior funders, but just to double check specifics. And with a name only, you can get hold of them without having to make 5 phone calls.
And if they don't have that information, then is that disqualifying? Or does that simply make them out of 100 and they lose all 20 points? Which would take them below our current threshold right now, but with all of the mix-up of scores as we were to go back through this, it could, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what it would do.
Well, that's what, my brain sort of went to
Yeah.
spaghetti trying to imagine
Right.
how it would roll out, especially, I mean, that's the way for it to be apples and apples. As Councilman Emerson said, you could maybe start at the top, because once you know if somebody's going to be under that threshold, even with an extra 30 points, would need to start there, unless it was radically changing, or radically failing, I guess.
So that would change our timeline, because today at 4 o'clock, we have, everything's teed up and ready to go out with this.
Correct.
So we would pull that back. So then the question, so I don't want to commit my team to say that we could meet that July 26th deadline of appeals.
I'm not sure, for our purposes, that that's critical. We do want the agencies to know, but I think that help me, I'm watching Brent here and Corey, that the only reason we have that is that in an ideal world, we're all done. It's way ahead of time for the agencies, but that way, if there was for some reason an issue that we wanted to change the amount of money that we allocated in our upcoming budget,
Correct.
it gave us time to do that. In the past, we've been in budget in July and August, and the budgets had to be finished by August 25th. And so typically part of our budget process is to affirm that line item. Obviously, at this point, we will probably, based on the state changing the law, we're going to have a little more time even on the budget. But I don't see, if we talked with you about how much time you thought you'd need to rerun this and do those checks, I think we're probably fine. Anybody, Corey or Brent?
Yeah, I think you're right on with regards
Okay.
to the timing. For us, it's simply a budget issue. We have to enter the number if you want to change. If you don't change the final
And
available
usually that doesn't
number,
happen.
you could wait till October to make your decision on that. It wouldn't be fair to everyone as far as they're planning their future.
Right.
But that's not going to affect, as long as you don't change that total number or want to and then go to council for that, then you're fine on delaying this publication and the appeals process.
Okay. So then, how much time would be reasonable for you all?
I mean, we can contact them and give them a 2-week deadline. It's just who to contact, because it's not just one person we contact. They would say, oh, this person does it, Nancy does it, so it would be
I'll do it for you, Juliet. So it's not just an issue of necessarily contacting one person. We may have to contact multiple people in order to
We've
be
got a
able to get the
program,
information.
grants administrator and a financial person,
Right.
probably, for instance. Yeah,
So
good
it's also
point.
July. It's also people on vacation, so it could be trying to get a hold of someone, and it might take a week for them to get back because they're not. I mean, I'm just trying to think
Well,
about
3
those types
weeks?
of things. I think so. 3 weeks. Yes. For us to have
Yes, maybe.
the scores finalized.
Right, it's just gonna depend on agencies getting back to us. I don't know who these other funders are. If you're
Yeah, I
talking
see.
about federal funding or state
Right.
funding, you're not gonna get a response from me.
If we're talking about federal funders, or if we're talking about larger funders, it may be a while before we're able to get that information. The question is, what if they say we can't release that information? And then we have to go back to the agency and say, because they say, who are you? United Way, because we're a vendor, we're not the city, so they may not take our word for it anyway. And then if we have to go back to the program and say, you need to sign a release of information in order to be able to give us this information. I mean, it could be a back and forth of a good while, multiple weeks. I mean, I don't, I don't want to put my team under
Chair,
Yes.
that much
I think
pressure.
3 weeks is way too tight. I mean, it just sounds like it would be way too tight for them. You know, what were you thinking in the way of yourself, Karen, for leeway? Because I agree with what he's saying. You know, it could end up with a lot of back and forth. So just right off the bat, I thought a month and a half, but
Well, and I just threw that out to get us started. On the one hand,
Yeah.
we don't want to drag it on forever, and to
Yeah.
some extent, you do something like this in a little blitz, you sit down and make all your first calls in a day or two and get it rolling, and then you clean them up, and nobody wants it to drag on anyway. So it's a matter of,
Friday, August 6th.
okay. And was that a suggestion both in terms of, if that's a goal for us to meet again?
I think that would be a goal for us to get it finalized.
Okay.
And then you probably want it for more than a night. So August 13th for a meeting, or sometime during the week of August 9th.
That,
And then
yeah,
once
because
they
I
are
don't want to
approved.
overrush you, but I don't want to kill you
Right.
with it either.
No, so then, once they are reviewed and approved, we will plan that day for the new scores to go out. And we
Okay.
would ask for a week from programs to decide whether or not they wanted to appeal. And they would need to contact us within that week by 5 o'clock on that deadline. And then we would know a week before, which is how we had planned this before. We would know a week before who the appeals were coming from. We would let the Social Services Grants Committee know who those appeals were coming from, and then we would schedule, if necessary, a meeting for appeals.
So you would still go with the plan that you had this time, which is that if you set yourself an August 6th deadline, you get us the materials then not too long before a meeting on August 13th, but enough time for us to review it. And then you would reset that email button for 4 o'clock in the afternoon after our meeting on the 13th.
Correct. And then they would have until 5 o'clock on August 20th to contact us for in writing that they wanted to appeal, and then we would have appeals on the 27th, if that's the timeline you wanted to choose. But that's an example.
Well, I think
of
sticking
a week,
with
a week, a
that
week.
rhythm, it's worked before, just again, get it up, get it over with, go on. Okay, so possible, okay, if committee members
I am out of town on the 13th.
on the 13th, are you out of town like all week?
No,
or-
I go out, leave at noon on the 12th. So I'll be here on the 11th, and I'll also be, next week I'm in town the whole week. Well, hold on.
So, well, if your goal is the 6th, then a meeting for us on the 11th could work,
Yes,
and for you?
as long as it were after 10, or 10 or after.
So, go to the 11th. Councilwoman, 11th is okay for you? And then after that, can we go back to that Friday, or would you rather go for the 25th?
We could go to the Friday, would be fine. If you want to do 20th and 27th.
Think so?
By the 20th, they would need to contact us by 5 p.m. if they wish to appeal, and then we would hear appeals on the morning of the 27th.
Okay. And if 10 to 12 continues to work for people, it always helps me to, it's kind of consistent. All right? Thank you, agencies, you're soaking this all up, so you'll be able to help us out here. We'll move on.
There.
Deborah Dawkins, East Topeka Senior Center. When we get our scores back, will we get an explanation of how we were scored or just the number?
We have the notes in there. Yes, we do have the notes in there. And those are notes that came from the panel scoring. And so we have those are all, for example, on this sheet that we have here, but we would have those for the agencies.
Thank you. So basically, the way it's been before,
Correct.
right? Okay. Any other questions from the group before we break? Well, thank you, everyone, for your contributions to this process and your work, and thanks for staying with this. And if there's something we missed, you know how to get hold of United Way and how to get hold of the city and how to get hold of us, so do it. And we will consider this meeting adjourned.
Yes, any complaints, go to the United Way.